and on we'll go.
Hello, my name is Martin Simon, and I'm your host for today's Taking Back Our Economy podcast from the Community Exchange Alliance. We are a learning community with many years of experience in community development and alternative mediums of exchange, such as sharing, swapping, gifting, bartering, and local community currencies. We believe that by sharing what we have learned and the methods and tools that have been developed along the way, we will motivate others to join us in reducing the disparities caused by society's ever-increasing fixation on the pursuit of money. Today, the other founders of the Community Exchange Alliance, Anitha Beberg, Christine Gray, Edgar Cahn, Tim Jenkins, and I are joined by Cormac Russell from Nurture Development in Dublin, Ireland. Cormac is a social explorer, an author, and a much sought-after speaker. He's Managing Director of Nurture Development and a faculty member of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute. Over the last 25 years, he has inspired and trained communities, statutory agencies, NGOs, and governments in community-led development in Africa, Asia, Australia, Oceania, Europe, and North America. His most recent book is entitled Rekindling Democracy, a professional's guide to working in citizen space. Okay, so thank you, Cormac, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Can we start by just hearing from you a brief history of ABCD and your involvement there and some of your latest thinking?
Sure.
I remember you talking to me before about never waste a good crisis, and we've got plenty of those going on now, but with the pain comes the opportunity, yeah?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's great to be with you all, and I have a sense of being with fellow travelers. So thanks for inviting me into your circle. And in terms of the history of ABCD and my relationship to ABCD, I always start with the acknowledgement, really, that ABCD gets you, you don't get it. So I think I was born into an openness to the idea that community really matters, because I spent the first 2 years of my life in an orphanage in Ireland. And then I was adopted both by a couple and I think by a community, really, a rural community in Ireland. And then I had the cradling that you get in an Irish community. So that buried quite deep within me an understanding in my bones of what community means and the importance of it. And I suppose then, as I grew into language and I grew up, I found words, and then I found John McKnight. And John McKnight has the great, extraordinary capacity to take the vernacular, take what we know to be true, and frame it in a way that makes it more powerful than it was before you met him. So I first met John in the early 90s. I was working for the Irish Health Board. I had trained as a clinical psychologist, and I was working, trying to take kids out of institutional care and bring them into community, what we were calling community care at the time. And the thing that really came home to me in the 90s was that there was neither care nor community in what we were doing. That all we really did was take them out of big institutions and put them in smaller institutions. And the first thing that John McKnight taught me is that institutions wear the mask of love. And so they have the exact same structure as Ford Motors, but the institutions like the Irish Health Board are essentially the same structure. And if you want these kids, he said, to have a real experience of love and a real experience of care, then you got to get beyond the institutional world and you've got to get serious about building community. And I realized at that point I had trained in the wrong profession. So I did a reverse and started to get serious in the early 90s about asset-based community development. So that's a little bit of biography about me, really. And my journey has been deeper and deeper into what it means to be in community and what it means as an outsider to be useful to those who are not in community yet. So that's really been the essence of my journey. And asset-based community development has been a great lens and a great set of practices that have enabled that to happen. So I know you've spoken with John and with Bruce, so they'll probably have given you a better account of their history. But I think one of the things that I was very curious about when I first met John and talked to a lot of the older faculty was why they'd never put down their history. So it struck me around about 2013, if John was to pass away, there would be nobody left behind who could articulate the heritage and the history of asset-based community development. So I was interested in chronicling that history and understanding the relationship of Saul Alinsky and Ivan Illich and Stan Hallett and people like that. So that's been a little bit of the first book that I wrote a few years ago. And Martin, you helped me with that to really try and get some of that history down and make sure that we're honoring our ancestors, as it were, and our wisdom holders. My current book is an attempt to say, you know, if we take the neighborhood as the atomic element of molecular democracy and really think about this idea of the impact that thinking about the neighborhood as the primary unit of change can have on our wider economies, our wider democracy, our wider ecological futures, it's really quite significant. And sometimes it's felt to me that in speaking about ABCD the way we have, it's felt quite folksy. And while there's great virtue in the smallness of it, sometimes it has felt that it has understated the value of what we're talking about and the great impact of what we're talking about. And so I wrote Rekindling Democracy because I wanted to really highlight for people who maybe weren't all that interested in ABCD or community development, how this way of thinking is really a homecoming for all of us. There are many different entry points into this conversation. For some, it's through the digital world. For others, it's through economics. And for others, it's just through the care of their family. But I wanted to write a book that said, I use the word rekindling as opposed to revolution. But if you take the simple idea that whenever we try to have a fire, a small campfire, we use what we have around us, the kindling, to start that flame. And that really, felt like a powerful metaphor for me. The other was I love the word rekindling because it has kindness in it. It has kinder in it, children, and it has rekinding. So this idea, similar to rewilding, of actually calling us back to what we knew all along and helping us remember what we know. And the final reason I used rekindling was because it felt to me that a lot of what we're trying to do is help people to make the invisible visible, and so a lot of what I'm calling people's attention to, and each of you are as well, has been rendered invisible by the modern materialistic world. So calling people back to those little pieces of kindling again is the essence of the book.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's such a crossover with what we're doing. Seeing the neighbourhood as the basis of it all. I don't think democracy, without neighbourliness, I don't think it's possible to have democracy, because one's only then talking to your own tribe. But if you, through neighbourliness, you extend that exchange to other people who you wouldn't normally meet, but you're practically living in the same place, it actually really, it's the basis of democracy, and without it, we really are in trouble. I think our main theme is reciprocity, giving, receiving, and reciprocating has been natural to people all along. Have you thoughts on the what we call the core economy of family, neighbourhood, community? I think in donut economics, it's been rechristened the unpaid care economy, which I think is very good. How that can be engaged in democracy?
Yeah, well, I do, and we talk a little bit about this in the book from a number of different angles. So there's a chapter which takes a feminist critique on the ethics of care and really begins to look at the wisdom of people like Vandana Shiva and people of that great wisdom tradition. but also looking at it from an economics perspective and a whole range of perspectives. Care, I think, is the great manifestation of love. But what I'm really curious about in my work anyway is if we think about care in terms of the tapestry of the neighborhood. So it's not the individual threads. It's not how can I be caring to you, Martin, and vice versa. I think that's important. And that kinship tradition matters. But it's how can we be in right relationship with each other, with some folks that maybe we don't agree with our local ecology, with our local economy. And that's where it gets really interesting, I think. Now, we all know that past a certain scale, you know, from my doorstep to the blue planet, there's a right, you know, threshold within which I can really show up in those relationships and not become broken apart. I know the city is not the right scale. I certainly know the state is not the right scale. I know the world is nice. You know, we all want to change the world. But for me, the neighborhood, the village is the great opportunity to think about all my relations, as the Indigenous, you know, Canadian elders will say, when they greet and they say hello, they say all my relations, you know, past, present, and future, and the non-human species as well. So for me, you know, that's our common heritage. That's what calls us into a common conversation, where we're really thinking about how might I do something which brings me into relationship with the people, the associations, the culture, the economy, and the place I move through and that moves through me. And what's the threshold at which that is meaningful and personal?
Yeah, fascinating.
For me, the word is ecosystem, because it's contained, but it's not totally self-contained, but it strives towards some element of self-sufficiency, but constant rebalancing to accommodate new forces, but to preserve the possibility of health and growth and fulfillment, and it's organic, and I think that neighborhoods have that quality, even though they look fixed, but they're not. But it leaves out I think for us, and the reason coming together is so important, is we all represent, this is a linkage process that we have between different, and not between, but among different networks, different cultures, different problems. I also think that in stressing the positive, we don't give adequate attention to the negative. My father gave me the gift of talking about justice as the process of either preventing or remedying what would trigger our sense of injustice. And I think all of us are building, partly driven by a sense of injustice about disparities which we consider we should not tolerate. And so everybody being happy is nice, but I think part of purpose is we're not happy with the world that we see around us. And that's a very powerful unifying set of energies.
Yeah, I agree. I've always been very hesitant about callings like happiness movements. It's always given me cause. I mean, I get the sentiment, and it's always felt a bit churlish to call people out when they were saying it, because, you know, I didn't want to make them unhappy. And it also seemed to me that sometimes some of the way that asset-based community development is articulated can come across as Pollyanna. You know, but I think that's to misunderstand it, actually, or to mischaracterize it. You know, the night that Rosa Parks was arrested and people decided that they weren't going to use the bus companies the next morning, and then they walked for 115 days. I mean, they were positive in the affirmation that they had feet and those were their assets and they were going to use them. I'm sure they weren't too happy with the idea of having to walk 10 kilometers and back from work, but they made a decision on the back of justice. So in a sense, it was this great heart lament, but the great affirmation that we will prevail because we will use what we have to secure what we want. And I think that demand, that call, that cry to justice is something that unites us, and we should speak more openly and more confidently about that.
It's the word purpose comes to mind as you speak. That we need purpose to drive us, not just sitting still and feeling good about the world around us as a sort of static ecosystem, but rather we do have a need to find purpose and meaning.
Yeah. And in a sense too, it strikes me that, the Kettering Foundation talk a lot about, because we want to talk about democracy. So the Kettering Foundation are interested in talking about how democracy would work if democracy worked like it should, right? Mm-hmm. And they would say that largely what motivates people in citizen life is to respond together collectively to problems that they can't respond to alone. And I think that's partially true. I think the other part of that is that one of the other callings of citizens is to collectivize around our creativity. We dance, we sing, we celebrate, we feast, we mourn, we lament, we get up, we go again. So in a sense, it's both the problem solving and it's the creation, it's the lament and it's the joy. And I think if we get locked on either side of that, then, we'll have one half of the community off on protests, but doing nothing when they come back home, and the other half at home, maybe not necessarily seeing protests as necessarily good, but, being involved in craftivism and things like that. And in a sense, one of the curiosities I have is how do we get those different purposes speaking to each other?
But we can't forget the world of market and money and price, which deals with scarcity. So that when you're talking our world, it's a world of renewal, but it needs things that are scarce. And so we have to negotiate the value of what we do in order to secure an infrastructure that takes money to get internet access, that takes us away from competing obligations or competing opportunities. And I don't think we talk adequately, not just about the significance of price, but how we give away something that world could not function without. It could not function without weird things like trust and respect and willingness to talk across boundaries, but we don't exact what we need in order to support the infrastructure. So we're always busy begging for money to support the infrastructure to defy the world that infrastructure defines.
Absolutely.
Discussion today is really about democracy and what is the ideal size of a democratic unit. Now, the world is divided up into, or currently divided up into countries, and a country really represents political expression of a local economy. So you could rather say that the world is divided up into many different economies, and those are really democratic units, if you like, because economy and politics are not separate entities. So, during this pandemic, we hear a lot about global reset and all sorts of things, and one world economies and new world orders. And one economy is the global planet, and and to go with that is like a global political system. So you wonder how democracy would operate where there's one global economy and there's one political system. because democracy at least needs 2 units. And if it's only 1 unit, how do you have democracy? So clearly we need to move in the opposite direction. And I think that's what Cormac was hinting at. And I like very much the title of his book, Rekindling Democracy, because it's looking at the meaning of democracy and like, what is the ideal unit? And as I was saying, a unit of democracy really is an economy or a local economy. And how big does an economy have to be? So in our current national system of economies, we have political systems and we have democracy, and then we have an election, and 50.1% wins the election and 49.9% loses. So in a sense, democracy is dictatorship of the majority. So what happens to the 49.9%? They're not much different to the 50.1%, but they have to do what the other side wants, and they might not want to do that. So clearly we need to break our political and economic systems down into very much smaller units to have true democracy. So what is the ideal unit? Do we need to have these huge economies that are destroying our planet? And surely a global economy and a global economic political system is going to do untold damage to our planet. It'll be the one system that destroys the one planet. So I think the discussion should really focus around what is the ideal unit. And from our practice in promoting alternative exchange systems is that the smaller the unit, the better, because everything is then scaled down and you don't have these mega corporations trying to run the world, bigger than local economies and bigger than local political systems. And the people themselves are then in control. And you don't have a dictatorship of the majority, because you can have different smaller units doing what they believe is correct and what they want. What we need to focus on, what is the ideal democratic unit? Is it one system for the world, or is it multiple smaller, more friendly units? So I think I'll leave it there now. And
yeah, and I think the word ecology and economy have the same root, which is ecos. So bringing us back to the household, but the household, one household is too small. So there's too small and there's too big. The nation state's too big, so Leopold Kohr, E.F. Schumacher have taught us, we have the heritage, we've done the brain work has been done in the, 40, 50 years ago. We understand, I think, that much of what we're trying to do here is really understand the scale of care, and within care, the foundational piece out of which everything evolves. The ecos comes around that. Economy and ecology are one and the same. We can't have one without the other. And it's really interesting during the pandemic at the moment to watch states trying to roll dice between the economy and the ecology and people's health. And of course, nature will win. So at one level, there's this scale wherein almost the Gaia, the organism of the blue planet, is humbling us for our speciesism, for the arrogance that one species of 8 million could do so much damage and think we could get away with it. So, that's at that scale. And it may feel very, very hard for people who are living in neighborhoods to take credible the idea that little old me in a neighborhood just being kind to my neighbors is enough to deal with this crazy world that we're living in. So I think we're in this dilemma, definitely around scale, where we got so many people who want to find the ideal platonic, solution to the world's problems. And here we are talking about small is beautiful and the local. And I suppose one of the things I'm wondering about is, what have you learned when you're speaking with people who have that dilemma, who want to bring things to scale, who are looking for big solutions, who want to change the world? And here we are, I'm with you, but here we are talking about the neighborhood. Do you know, when they look at you skew ways, what response do you give them?
I'd respond to that by saying the strategy was a medium of exchange that was both local and not local. Money certainly has that function in one world, in a world of scarcity, but we did not have a medium of exchange for kinds of conduct and kinds of values that are not bounded by price. And so, but we needed a different medium of exchange, and I had hoped that time could function as that, because we've all got a piece of that.
I was going to say local community currency is another way of doing it. It doesn't have to be time. Time is also an alternative currency, but to focus on the local community, it would be better to adopt a local community currency, because the way tech companies are taking over, for example, Amazon, even if there is some sort of basic income, which I'm a proponent of, giving out to people to sustain themselves, and those who are not fortunate to have gotten a big inheritance or whatever the family they come from, it's important that that money that they are given is spent locally and not at an Amazon or somewhere else. That it's important to, for a successful community, that local economy has to be strong. So we have to take care of each other. And I like that about time banking and the ABCD movement, that we're all pooling our resources in terms of time, money, goods, whatever it is. But it's also important that the local governments give some sort of basic income to ensure that the basic, the Maslow's hierarchy, if you want them to uplift each other and all that, the basic necessities need to be taken care of.
I found myself thinking scale is one question, but issue. But I remember when I was studying my political science, one of the early texts I read was about the constrictions of small communities and how limiting they could be and how oppressive they could be. And this was a book written in the 60s. Civil rights movements were going, and expanding out of breaking the bounds of those local communities was seen as absolutely vital to securing the rights of minorities who were oppressed in those communities. And so I think it comes down, yes, there's the question of scale, but there's also the question of the dynamic interplay between large and small. And in fact, we will not get away from large now because we're so interconnected. And so I believe that the challenge of our time is, how do we look at the concurrence of these things and actually have the interrelationship between the large and small be more effective. Right now, the large dominates and the small is practically disappeared by the largeness of things. And so speaking up for the small is really, really important, but I think it needs to be done in such a way, and perhaps you do with the Rekindling Democracy, it has to be done in such a way that somehow we reconfigure the relationship between large and small.
And that's exactly what I'm trying to do in Rekindling Democracy, is to take ABCD onto that level and say that what we're talking about is the proliferation of mass localism. It's not about staying small, closed and turned inwards, where we kind of fend ourselves against the harsh giantism of the outer economies and hope we survive. It's about how do we create the production of the masses as distinct from mass production. I mean, scarcity as the model isn't just a model around which money is organized, it's the model around which health is organized, or sorry, treatment is organized, let's not call it health. And it's the model around which indoctrination, in inverted commas, education is organized. So education, the whole model is that we have a bunch of people who are scarce in knowledge and we're going to sort them out. Health is the same. We've got a bunch of people who are scarce in whatever health is meant to to look like in a hospital, and we're going to sort them out. And I think in mass localism, what we're saying is that there are ways in which people can organize themselves, which by consequence produce safety, produce health, and produce prosperity in a way that's useful to the local biospheres and the ecology of local places. And if that can be done regionally, and that can be done through mass localism, we have a chance of proliferating a better story. Because the one thing we can do as human beings is we can spread stories, and we can spread better ones, as well as being victims of difficult ones. And that's really the essence of what I'm interested in. So I think ABCD says, if you're interested in doing something at neighborhood scale, talk to us. But beyond that, we don't have a lot to say. Now, that's not always a bad thing. I mean, Murray Bookchin would talk about municipalism, right? And this idea that our movement, the movement of care and the movement of social solidarity, is probably best kept at the scale of the municipal, not the neighborhood. So you get clusters of neighborhoods, and then you get municipalities and mayors working together. And we've seen some, I think in the North American context, we've seen some real traction around mayors taking responsibility in terms of how they're responding to the pandemic, and to an extent in Brazil, we're seeing that too. So I think that scale is really interesting. So it takes us a little bit beyond the neighborhood to the municipal scale and to the regional scale. And actually that's what E.F. Schumacher was teaching in Small is Beautiful. So there is too small and there is too big. And I think the question isn't small or big, actually. I think the question is about right relationship and proportionality. So it's what Leopold Kohr was talking about in The Breakdown of Nations in his 1940s book. And I think kind of recognizing that there's nothing wrong actually with mainstream economy, but if mainstream economy gets disembedded from local culture, then it eats its young, it cannibalizes. So when it's kept within check and it's kept rooted in culture, then possibilities open up. And that's one of the things I was curious about in this conversation. I feel very cautious to default to the word economy as the primary unit. My bias would be to default towards culture as the primary unit, and then to sit economy into that nest. So I was curious to hear your thoughts around why economy feels like a comfortable, irreducible minimum when it comes to care.
I wanted to talk a little bit about that. By using culture, especially if you're in a very diverse, America is diverse. People are from different cultures here, and just building community is a difficult thing here. Even if somebody is living all in one neighborhood, most people don't know each other and they stick to their own, or they will, talk to and join other communities. And it's not about local. Those that are more homogenous in terms of culture and race and all that's where the communities really work better together. So I would rather use economy than culture, because then people will think, well, that's not my culture is this. Unfortunately, America is a big salad bowl. I wouldn't say melting pot. We're not melting. It's a big salad bowl of different things. And people want to be independent and different. And when we say a culture, people will say, hey, that's not my culture. And then you get more, disagreement than agreement. And economy is, we can all agree, yes, we need some sort of, whatever you define as money to sustain us. So at least that is something in common. We all are using dollar notes in the US, right? So.
Well, there's a different model possible, entirely possible, that's ecological. It starts with how cells divide and how they create organs, and how those organs have different functions, but they all come from one cell. And maybe we need to begin to look at the human body as an evolutionary model of how do we get heart and arms and legs and organs around purpose, and how did that evolve, and what was the purpose that prompted that evolutionary development? Because it's a different way of thinking about one, how you stick with what you've got, but how you don't stick with what you've got.
Yeah.
How you're always asking why and what do I use it for?
I really like that, because I think that the difficulty is that we're kind of caught between elementalizing everything and moving into transaction, or else trying to find, I think what we're called to, as much as care and love and kindness and justice, is wholeness. And that's a biological imperative. We're all called to wholeness. And it's even interesting how we elementalize culture, and we say, well, we won't use culture because there are races of people, or people who have specific ethnic cultures that won't relate to each other. But I get that, and I think that makes sense. So we're fearful of elementalizing. We're fearful of dividing people, and so we're trying to find ways of creating a table that everybody can be invited to. And I think Edgar's point is excellent in that regard, because the one table we're all invited to is we're all part of the human race. We all kind of ecologically kind of work pretty much the same way if we get over the silliness and the racism and whatnot. So that ecological question is a really interesting one. And historically, if you go way back before John McKnight and you look at the very early influences of ABCD, one of the guys who was hugely influential in the ABCD thinking was a guy called Stan Hallett, who taught at Northwestern. And Stan was very, very influenced by E.F. Schumacher. Now, Stan Hallett had this model, which I thought was the neatest thing I've ever heard, called fichoir, right? So basically what he said is, whenever you want to do something useful, you've got to figure out how you can do something that does no harm to fichoir, which is food, energy, waste, air, and water. And then you've also got to figure out what you're going to do to enhance that, whether that's spending money, doing something around education, health, whatever it might be. If you can figure out how to do it in a way that uplifts the fichoir and certainly does no harm to it, then you're on to something. And call it whatever you like. But that's the ecological acid test. And he was able to look at most community development and show that it was harmful to fichoir, most of what was called development.
Well, I need to throw in something else that's a little bit confusing. It is boundlessly confusing, and that's spirituality. I consider myself to be part of a tradition in Judaism. The core of that has been around justice and injustice. I can't dismiss that. We can't help but ask, why are we here? What does our species add? And what can we do as a species, maybe to preserve the planet, the possibility of life? So I just need to throw in that notion.
A beautiful insight.
That we're all asking purpose as well as survival.
One of the things that triggers for me is the importance of Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And, that we intentionally create space for community. And we say, here's a marker past which the marketplace doesn't get in for this period of time. And I think one of the things I've always appreciated Judeo-Christian traditions around Sabbath is this principle that on at least one day a week, we create nothing, we destroy nothings, but on that day, we simply celebrate what is, spiritual act.
And we're part of an eternal what is.
Yeah.
Which is time, I started a law school based around the notion that wouldn't it be nice if I was actually able to help somebody during those 3 years, and if my competency did not have to go into suspended paralysis until I got a degree that made me an officer of the court. And so the whole question of function and of appropriate function and of readiness for function and of what are your fallbacks? Because we're all going to make mistakes. And are we going to build in backups so that the mistakes don't have costs that we hadn't intended?
I think the whole question of function is really important, because we're schooled to think that functions belong to institutions and to professionals. So my health is in the hands of a doctor, my safety in the hands of a police officer. And what gives me hope is if I see what's happening in Milwaukee at the moment as a beacon of hope, where I'm seeing police departments relocate money which they would have spent doing harm to people, locking them up, essentially incarcerating them, and reinterpreting their role, their civic functions around change and help, and how they manage budgets, which is essentially public money, moving it upstream and saying, let's recognize it's the same 15 neighborhoods that are producing the alumni of our prisons. It's the same 15 neighborhoods that are filling our ERs. It's the same 15 neighborhoods that have 47% people, you know, who are lonely, etc. And let's get serious about social cohesion. Let's do something about that. And taking the money and saying, you know what, employ some community animators, set up some community time banks, do what you need to do to address the root issue here, which is cohesion. Your tapestry is pulling apart. It's threadbare. Let's do something about that. And on that, we'll build economy, we'll build health, we will build justice together. And I think that's the message, Martin, that people will actually come on board with, because at the moment, the story is the only way I'm going to get better in my life is if somebody out there with the right qualification comes in and rescues me. And it's the other dimension of kindling. What I'm really challenging is this idea that we're crouched over kindling, waiting for some expert to come and light our fire. And it's not going to happen. What I've really appreciated about this conversation is that sense of being with friends, even though I haven't met all of you before. But that sense that because we have common purpose and because we genuinely deeply care about what we do and each other, we're able to have such a lovely conversation. And I genuinely feel, you know what, that's what people are hungering for. We've had 4 or 5 years of the most horrible uncivil exchanges around the world. And it's just so lovely to have conversations like this. And I take great heart in the idea that these are recorded and you're sharing them. And I think we could turn the volume down and people could watch them and not hear any words and just watch people falling in love with each other. And that would be enough. Everything else is a bonus. So thank you very much.
Recent obsession with gratitude. I think gratitude is such a powerful, powerful thing. We need a lot more of it. Anybody else?
I was just going to jump back to Cormac's point about whether it's culture or economy that is the defining entity. Well, I can imagine that if you live in a place like Ireland, you would see culture as important, but I'm in South Africa, which is, you know, the most divided society in the world. We have different races and multitude of languages and so on. So it's hard to say there's a single culture that we organize around. But I think the problem is that it's not a binary situation, either economy or culture, because an economy, in my way of thinking, is really just a place where you make money rather than a place where we produce our means of existence. And that's why we're all into these alternative exchange systems, because we're trying to really get rid of this entity called an economy. We're trying to create exchange relationships between people where we do things for each other, and our communities are built around what we can do and give to each other rather than how we can make money. So really that's the defining entity as far as I'm concerned, and whether we call that culture or not. But it's a midway between culture and what we think of as economies.
It does speak to core dynamics of how we human beings be in the world in a way that will ensure its future well-being. And right now, we're not being in a way that will do that. We're ensuring that it's going to get rougher and rougher and rougher. It's not looking great right now. We have some tremendously significant issues to deal with around the fact that we have institutionalized our societies, and we must, as much as we must look at how we re-neighbor ourselves, we actually have to look at the awesome power that we've put into institutions and how those institutions use and abuse that power, which is, of course, a big part, I'm sure, of your Rekindling Democracy, is those institutions have to somehow, they can't be tamed, but they have to be reformed so that there's a good relationship between the neighbors, the neighborhoods that you're talking about, and the big institutions that do drive our economies. So thank you so much for sharing. That was quite beautiful.
Thank you.
I feel what we saw was two streams of energy. One I'll call learning, and the other I'll call growing, and the other I'll call caring. So you have learning and caring, and those caring is a sustaining energy. Learning is a growth energy, a growth and change energy. And the two have to coexist. And I feel we live in an age where we've been given a gift in the digital world that enables us to look at the infrastructure, to keep asking what's the infrastructure needed to maintain that balance, and how do we maintain an infrastructure that keeps both moving and both in balance with each other. But it is a gift that we live in an age where we've been provided with a new tool, and we're using it. We're trying to use it in time banking, but it would be true of learning, it would be true of caring, it would be true of so many things, but we have that opportunity.
My mind's always racing of how we can connect and work with each other better. I know that our community exchange and what we plan to do, at least all of us within Community Exchange Alliance, we really would like to work more with the ABCD movement and see how we can align, because they're both good ideas and they both work. So why not join hands and partner together? So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you'll find that people are hugely open to that. But maybe what we need to do is just, like everything, is kind of do it, so we make the path by walking. And it might be that we need to identify a couple of key neighborhoods and just jump in, build the social capital, build the trust, because all of this, I think social movements go at the speed of trust. And so perhaps that's what we could do next, is actually just find some stuff to do together.
That's fine with me. So this brings this podcast to an end. Please check us out at www.communityexchangealliance.org or on Twitter at community_exchange. You can partner and get involved as an individual, a network, platform, or a community. Thank you so much. Really interesting evening.
Thank you, guys. That was great.
No, I don't want to waste what's left.